Hello and welcome to Clear Conversations. Today's session is setting financial services growth strategies for 2020 on beyond recovery. My name is Geraint Jones and I'm Clare Saatchi's Global Marketing Director. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. It's great to see some old friends and new joining us from brands like Santander, Western Union, Aviva, HSBC, MetLife, Citi, Swiss Re, and many other brilliant financial services brands. We're also, as I've said, streaming this session live on LinkedIn, so a warm welcome to our audience there. And just to confirm to everybody who's joining us, as an attendee, your camera and microphone are automatically switched off, and you won't be able to turn them on accidentally, so you can absolutely relax, especially if you're at home eating breakfast in the United States of America right now. This session is being recorded, and we'll be sharing it with attendees and those who couldn't make it early next week. So watch out for an email from my colleagues Saskia or Gary in your inbox very soon. This is actually the final conversation in our first season that over 1,500 marketers from around the world have attended over the last 6 months. And I'm delighted to say that later this month, you'll be able to listen back to the edited highlights of the whole of season 1 in our new podcast series. For updates about season 2, starting on October the 7th, and to watch recordings of this and other conversations, you can visit clearstrategy.com or follow us here at Clare Saatchi on LinkedIn. Should you wish to ask a question as we get into the panel discussion later, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A functionality. If you start your question with the name of the panelist that you'd like to answer, for example, if you want to ask Ellie a question, you'd start the question with Ellie and then put your question in the box. Right, I think that's enough for now in terms of the admin stuff, so on with the show. So a bit about us. Clare is the strategy consultancy arm of Saatchi, and as such, for us, the crisis has had a pretty polarizing impact on our business. It's been felt differently in every single sector, in every single country, and in every single part of every single sector. And today's session focuses on what happens for us beyond the crisis as we look towards 2021. It's not going to be straightforward or simple. I think we all know that. But our firm belief here at Clare is that even amongst all this chaos, the opportunity to change for good has never been greater. And that's in two ways: the sense that we're all changing enormously, but also there's a really positive opportunity for change, particularly within the financial services category. Our strategy director for corporate and financial services, John Riley, will share some of his perspectives on the evolving role of marketing and marketers before we debate some questions raised by that change with our fantastic panel. So let me introduce those. I'm delighted to welcome Raj Kumar, who was recently named as one of Marketing Week's top 100 most effective marketers in 2020. He's the Group Brand and Reputation Director at Aviva PLC, the leading UK insurer. Prior to Aviva, he held leadership roles in Europe and Asia with companies like Siemens, Experian and Nokia. And Raj believes in performance that's underpinned by building a positive, honest and inclusive culture that embraces change. We're also joined by Ellie, who is a senior marketer with extensive experience working across global businesses in travel, financial services, including TUI, Marriott Hotels, Aviva, RSA, and JLT. She recently became marketing director at a leading insurance company, Ageas Insurance, and in her first 6 months has launched their Ageas Direct insurance brand. We're also joined by Leigh Peacock-Goodwin. Leigh is the head of marketing and PR at Challenger Bank Atom here in the UK. He's responsible for all aspects of the marketing at Atom for both B2C and B2B audiences, and was one of Atom's first 30 employees. Prior to this, he worked at a number of London advertising agencies, including RKCR-Y&R, Saatchi and Glue London, working on a range of clients from Guinness and Land Rover to Vodafone and RBS. And finally, we're joined by Neil Costello, the UK Marketing Director at Lowell. Neil is a builder of iconic financial services brands founded in the power of customer experience. He's currently leading the growth and profile of the biggest unknown financial brand in the UK, focused on rebuilding the financial health of consumers. Previously at Atom Bank with Leigh, Neil was awarded one of the inaugural Marketing Academy scholarships for the top 20 fastest growing marketers on the client and agency side. And from Clare Saatchi, John Riley. John co-leads our financial services practice at Clare, and before joining, he worked at Profit, where he helped clients such as MetLife, Swiss Re, Anglo American and Samsung develop some really impactful strategies to drive differentiation, relevance and growth. I'm now going to hand over to John, who will share with us some thoughts on the role of senior marketers in a post-COVID world.
So thank you, Geraint, for that introduction. I'll try to move through this quickly because the part that you all want to hear is our lovely panel discussion. But really, what I want to set the scene with is just a discussion around how FS firms can pivot to growth as we recover from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But importantly, thinking about the role of the CMO or heads of marketing and how that function can play a really pivotal role in terms of charting that path back to growth. I'll talk about some of the opportunities we see unique to the role of the CMO or marketing departments, that with the right strategies and with the right plans, can really set up that function to be really at the core of getting beyond recovery and back into growth as we move beyond the pandemic. So as a start point, I wanted to talk about the different types of CMOs that we see existing out there. There's a really great paper in the Harvard Business Review from back in 2017 that did some interesting analysis, interviewing CMOs, heads of marketing, as well as CEOs about their impression of the CMO role. And they also did a deep dive analysis into the different types of job specs that have been written for CMO positions to really understand the job of the CMO. The implicit understanding being that that title can actually sit over a wide-ranging and constantly changing set of responsibilities. One of the things that they found was that there were really three distinct types of CMO roles. So the most prevalent, so around 46% of the roles that they looked at, fell within the commercialization role. So really being responsible for driving sales through marketing communications, specifically advertising, digital, social media channels, promotions, and events, etc. So this was definitely the most prevalent. But they also found two other roles that were significant. The second being a strategy role. So CMOs that were really responsible for defining the growth strategy. So things like owning customer insight, driving innovation, and product and experience design. And then finally, around 23% of the roles that they looked at fell within the enterprise-wide P&L role. I'm not sure that's the pithiest name, but essentially it means that they were responsible for both the strategy side and the commercialization side of the equation, and really had ultimately P&L responsibility. I think what was interesting about this analysis and what it can teach us is sort of a discussion around sort of role fit and role clarity. So when CEOs felt like their CMOs were performing quite well, and we know that given the average CMO tenure, that's not always the case, it was because there was a really clear fit between what the CEO expected the CMO to do and what was within the CMO's remit in order to be actually able to do. And so within that analysis was this idea that if you are in a business where the kind of core competencies as it relates to kind of strategy, what was really going to make or break the business was an internal function, right? So it was about your expertise in manufacturing or operations or technology. Then the CMO playing that commercialization role would be the most impactful in that role, because really they were the ones responsible for really shouting from the rooftops about what was so great about that internal capability, and then really driving those sales. Conversely, if you were in a market where growth is hard to come by, or things are changing rapidly, or your external environment was changing, then CMOs that really played the strategy role of the enterprise-wide P&L role were the ones that were really able to be the most impactful, primarily because they own the customer insight, they own the market landscape, really understanding the impacts of trends and changes on the organization. You could own that data at the senior decision-making table to really help set strategy and help define new paths for growth. So I think we would all agree that the past couple of months have been a time of incredible flux. And so we think CMOs have a unique capability and responsibility really to lead the way. Really like this Deloitte quote here: if the customer isn't built through the business strategy, then you don't have a strategy. So we think this is really a perfect time for CMOs to sort of embrace this responsibility for future growth and to start to drive strategic decision-making at enterprise level. And we've actually had lots of clients asking us in the past couple of months around what are the things that they can be doing to arm themselves with the insight around changing customer needs, really understanding sort of which of these changes will stick and which ones might revert back to normal, or sort of what is on the horizon. So that they can really go into those leadership discussions with a strong point of view about what might potentially happen and how to react. And we think increasingly companies' business models are going to be undergoing lots of shifts. Industry boundaries are being redrawn. The world is changing quite rapidly. And I think financial services is definitely at the forefront of these changes, which I think really adds sort of further support behind this opportunity for the CMO. So we think that the time is really now. And why now? But we think it's because businesses are really looking around for what's next. We know that we've all dealt with massive disruption, but that we're going to be dealing with a series of rolling and unpredictable crises over the foreseeable future, whether they be public health crises or rolling economic shocks, or just societal changes more broadly. But we spent a lot of time, we think, over the summer thinking about managing a crisis, and now it's about thinking about how we actually set ourselves up to go into the future with a bit more direction, clarity around where growth is going to come from, and the ability to drive confidence among both internal and external stakeholders. So just talk about these in turn briefly. But we think direction is really critical in terms of understanding how we pivot from BAU experiences that we're used to sort of in a pre-COVID era to sort of whatever that new normal will look like without losing relevance and distinctiveness. And that really comes down to how are we going to continue to deliver against a sort of unique or differentiating brand promise in a world where customer needs are constantly changing? So I think in FS in particular, we've seen a flight to digital that is probably here to stay. But how do you actually maintain that distinctive customer and client experience when we're all sort of delivering those experiences through similar digital portals or applications? And it might mean that you need to sort of do some of that due diligence around just really making sure that you're staying close to that customer and you're really understanding not just how the behaviors are changing, but some of the attitudinal or broader, more economic drivers behind those behaviors. So you can understand how to not just sort of respond sort of in the short term, but develop new propositions and experiences that are going to be relevant for the future. And really, we think the direction will come from really owning that role that marketing should have as the owner of customer insight to be able to do that. Ultimately, we need to be sort of growth-oriented as marketers. And so whether it's sort of filling growth gaps from parts of your business that are underperforming due to the pandemic, or really seizing new opportunities that sort of the situation has thrown up for us, we really think that we should be proactive about going to that top table with ideas about how to really drive that growth. And that starts with making sure, going back to the understanding of customer needs, that we're really on the front foot around those emerging customer needs so that we can drive customer-oriented innovation. And in addition to always making sure that we can understand sort of where to play from an opportunity identification perspective, as well as how to unlock those opportunities, really having a good sense of when to start investing. So when is the right opportunity to pull the plug? When is there something that we think still fits our longer term roadmap, but actually might not make sense and we need to pivot away from? And also really having a clear understanding of when it makes sense to be a category leader, to really go out there on the limb, do something more disruptive, versus when it's perfectly fine and okay for your strategy to be a fast follower to go after that opportunity. So more agile learning techniques are going to be important to deliver that, but really making sure that you're having the data and the information to go to your sort of CEOs and your CEOs with the business case to sit behind those growth strategies will be increasingly important. And then finally, we don't want to lose sight of the important role that CMOs play in being able to set a corporate narrative that really ties together the context of a firm, the vision of a firm, and the strategy of a firm to be able to get there. So we think this is right now the perfect time to make sure that you're giving your colleagues at senior level within the organization and those external stakeholders for whom it's relevant, the clear understanding of the narrative of your organization, making sure that you, within that narrative, anchor that narrative and things that are going to be relevant to those relevant stakeholders, that you use that narrative to re-engage colleagues and making it clear what their role is in delivering that strategy. And also, depending on your context, making sure that any change that folks on the outside are going to witness from you are clearly explained to customers, potentially talent, investors, those other external stakeholders that are giving you license to operate, license to make big bets, or ultimately are going to be impacted by those decisions. So really making sure that that narrative is clear, and that you're really intentional about how you communicate to the various stakeholders. It's going to be critically important to making sure that those growth opportunities you've identified are really, you're able to see sort of the benefits of your labor there. So that's all that I had to share, and without further ado, I'll hand it back over to the panel.
Thank you, John. Really good as always. I thought it was a lovely setup for what I'm hoping will be a really interesting conversation. So let's start by asking everybody the same question, and I think I'll start with you, Raj, if that's all right. I think from my perspective, it's been fascinating to look at the crisis and think about the actions that people have been taking kind of in the here and now and over the past few months to sort themselves out. But now as we look towards 2021, I'm really interested in a couple of things. You know, what's on your plate for next year? How has it really been reshaped or not by COVID? And how can you as a senior marketing leader, as a CMO, ensure that you're listened to when it comes to, you know, shaping the future direction of your business?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me, firstly. I think, you know, this is not just COVID, actually. And when we look at it, the macroeconomic effect of something that we know is coming, but have stopped talking about recently, is Brexit. So it's two big macroeconomic effects, actually. So when we're looking at stuff, we're not just looking at what behavioral and attitudinal changes we're seeing, because they're right now, I would say, we're like in a test environment almost. And what happens when everybody's let out free in the world, how much of it will stay? Some of it, like already mentioned by John, like the digital interactions, yes, it's being accelerated, but then, you know, what else? So, so for us, it's all about the scenario planning, really. So in the medium term, what we're seeing right now is a huge amount of exploration demand. So we have daily monitoring, really, and I look at weekly reports from that. We're seeing a lot of demand of people who are interested now in financial services. They're looking more for information about, you know, how do I protect myself? What kind of pensions am I invested in? What kind of savings do I want to make, or investments do I want to make? Is my illness policy enough for me or not, etc. So what we're seeing is a raised interest, really, and also a demand for knowledge. So whereas in the beginning, you might just, you know, we were just on the acquisition trail as one of the major exercises. Now it's also a lot about the education, and it's not easy, right? Financial services can be quite complicated for the best of us. But we are seeing this demand for expertise rise. So whereas previously you might just consider what your friends and family told you, but we are now seeing an increased thirst for knowledge, let's say. So we have a role to play definitely in that. So that's one thing to look at. It's also important that we look at the long-term brand building. And I cannot stress that this has to be dependent on your own data. This has to be dependent on your own business. Showing a slide which says those who advertise and downturns come up much better is useless, really. It has to be in your own arena. You know, look at the propositions you have. What are the propositions that will go? So what we're ultimately looking at is scenarios. There is a lot of uncertainty. And therefore, when we're looking for the short term, it's much easier actually in the shorter term, so the here and now. What we're looking at the medium term, let's say 2021, it is all about scenario building. It is all about seeing what are the different things that could play out, the implications of those, and making sure we're ready for that. And in this sense, the marketing absolutely always does play, marketing and comms, or both actually absolutely always play a pivotal role. I mean, when you talk about people looking outside in, they just see one brand and they give feedback on the brand. and we get that feedback. So whatever the internal silos are, and similarly, when we're talking from inside out, we take the best of what is inside and we make sure we make the best inside and then take it out. So we are naturally, marketing and comms, I would say, a hub for the organization who naturally work across all the silos. So I think we're in a privileged position to not only execute on strategy, but also help inform strategy because of our two-way role. So that's how I see it.
I think it's a really comprehensive view of the challenge that I think is being faced by many marketing leaders. I think we talked a bit yesterday about this, didn't we, Ellie? About the sort of the mix of things that are being pulled across your plate, and the sort of the need to have influence. I mean, what's your perspective on this? You know, has it dramatically changed your approach? Are you working hard to make sure that marketing has a greater voice at the table, or conversely, are you being asked to have a greater voice at the table for 21?
Yes, and again, thank you for having me on the panel. Yes, I think, we talked yesterday a bit about how, as well as doing the traditional marketing role, marketing in the changing times that we're in are being stretched and asked to do a bit more, a bit extra, and also to share the knowledge that we have about customers with the rest of the business even more than we have done in the past, particularly with the changing customer behaviours that we're seeing, and the rest of the business wanting as much knowledge about that as they can, and us regularly being the custodians of that. So I think that definitely we're having to prioritise, we're having to look at our work stack and understand what's the most important things to be focusing on, and help the business to understand what the most important things to be focusing on, and that the areas of growth are changing, and we need to keep a track of those and make sure that we're on top of those and stepping forward into those and helping the business to do that. So I definitely think, just thinking about the three different roles of the CMO, I would imagine if you do that again in a few months' time, the role of the CMO across the whole business will be far more than it has been in the past. Certainly the information sharing piece and the role of advisor to the organisation is definitely a role that we're seeing marketing play, not just within our own organisation, but across the board.
Neil, you're at an interesting place at Lowell, being a business that's focused on rebuilding people's financial health. Raj talked about a desire for people amongst consumers for more expertise and support during what are really quite painful times for some. And at the same time, we also talked about, what Ellie was just talking about, sort of the ability for marketing to help shape the direction of a business. You're living that right now. Is that not the case?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think my observation, and I'd echo a lot of the comments already said, but I'm long enough in the tooth, and I'm sure there's a few others on the call to know that we've been through periods where esteemed academics and people like that have given us steers of profound change, dare I say, that's going to hit marketing, and everything's going to change and shift. But even just during this period, as turbulent as it is, I think marketers, in a lot of the stuff I read, sometimes forget the simplicity of what we're here to do. And it's connect your product to your customer and change perception and behavior, and that's it at its core. And so for me, it's you've got to look long and hard at your organization and go, right, am I interesting to a customer, and am I useful to a customer? And even so more during this period, because I think customers have been pretty accommodating over the last 6 months of the challenges that brands have gone through, but they're coming out of the back of it now with even higher expectations, and it's for us to I guess lead that charge internally.
Are you seeing that, Leigh? The sort of the expectations thing, the sort of the higher expectations, but also the greater kind of desire amongst the executive committee at a place like Atom to engage with marketing, which, as Ellie said, as Raj said, as Neil said, is right at the forefront of actually understanding these dramatic shifts we're seeing in behaviour, in attitude, in all sorts of other areas.
Definitely, and I think the thing for me in the fortunate position I think we're in is that we're still a relatively small company, and we're all relatively interlinked, if that makes sense. So, whereas potentially in larger companies and companies I've worked in before, there is that kind of disconnect where things are passed up the chain. Then as they are passed up the chain, they have slight tweaks to them. And eventually when the kind of information gets right up to the top, it doesn't have the poignancy or the accuracy that you'd have usually. But I think Neil's exactly right. The simple thing of what marketing does, both internally and externally, is to be able to take relatively complex things, whether it's products or behavior and insight, reduce it down to its simplest form and communicate that in a way that is receptive. So what we've seen from a marketing perspective and the analysis that we do is that it has become more and more of interest, and it's starting to shape the way we communicate across the board, from the notifications potentially that we send to customers during this time, as well as the advertisements that we go out with. So it is having a systemic change. We're fortunate as a marketing team that we are given a lot of autonomy and trust. It helps, I think, that our CMO, Mark Mullen, was a marketer, a senior marketer himself. So we kind of have that trust and that understanding at that level. But yeah, I think marketing has always played an important role at Atom, but it is much more a kind of role that's involved across the board at Atom, because it's grown up with Atom, if that makes sense, all the way from, as you introduced me earlier, all the way from, a team of 30 up to 400 we have now. There's always been a marketing presence within there. So there's always been that line of communication.
It's an interesting jump-off point for an aside question that I want to throw back at the group a little bit, which is, we're obsessed a little bit with this idea that for a long time now the CMO role has been attacked, I think, for its use, value, the sort of capabilities of the people in the role, all that sort of good stuff, which has been quite painful. And if you look at some of the kind of commentary in the industry from people like Mark Ritson, there's a sense that, people believe that CMOs, marketers in general, have become just about promotions. And our little kind of theory, I guess, or our perspective is that is being changed as we live through COVID. I mean, there are some lovely examples of CMOs, particularly in financial services, interestingly, who have been promoted up into CEO roles and who have run their businesses. Paul Getty's at Direct Line. I think HSBC have just promoted their marketing director into the CEO role at First Direct. So there is some really interesting shifts going on. And I think what I'd be interested in is the perspective of you, Raj, I guess, on the extent to which it's because the skill set of those marketing leaders has become so broad, and they've had to turn their hands, you yourself have had to turn your hands to so many different pieces, from technology to strategy to customer insight, that actually you're in a position where, unlike many of your colleagues in the ExCo, you have to cover so much that you're actually one of the best placed to manage the chaos of a crisis like this.
Yeah, I think, when you look at marketing, and as has already been said, I think being customer centric is quite narrow, to be honest. We've seen so much being thrown towards boards and execs right now. It's coming. I mean, you're talking about all the triple bottom line. You're talking about the planet. You're talking about the profit. You're talking about the people. So when we talk about the business also, and customer centricity just actually is one part, but needs to be widened away. And when you look at the breadth of those relationships, you find a lot of marketing people have been dealing with those breadth of relationships and know the pulse. So when we look into it, and absolutely, I think so, when we look into the kind of jump into CEO roles, I don't tell this to my CFO, but when I look at CFOs, I usually go CF knows, that's what they are. And no marketer ever joins a company not to grow it, if I can put a double negative. So I think marketers by default have an expansionist mindset. And when you're searching for growth, you would argue that, they make, and the fact that they interact with the breadth of the company, as I said before, and the fact that you add on that they know how to communicate that succinctly, as Neil was putting it, to the external world, it puts you in the right position and the right kind of mindset to be able to lead in chaos. Because to be honest, our world is quite chaotic. We don't get a set of we deal with, let me put it another way, we deal with ambiguity quite a lot as marketing people, and that's what it is today. So for me, it is definitely one of the things that is valued much more now, given all the disruption, and I think it is prime position. Yeah,
it's a challenge we hear back from so many people who are your peers in different industries as well. I thought your point about the fact that, actually, I really loved the point you made earlier about the sort of the sense that just saying we should all advertise our way through the crisis applies to everybody, whatever size business you are, whatever sector you're in. I'm so glad you've called that out, because it's been such a challenge to see brands who perhaps should have spent money elsewhere spending money on comms that have potentially been wasted through the crisis.
Absolutely.
Consultants, it's been quite interesting to watch. I'm going to move on to sort of that idea of managing change, actually, and I'm going to come to you next, Ellie. This is an interesting crisis for a number of reasons, and for FS businesses in particular, it's interesting because it's not their fault. The last crisis, I think we could very clearly place the blame at the feet of the banks and the financial services community. But actually this time, it feels like there's a real opportunity for brands to rehabilitate their position in the financial services industry with consumers. And we talked a bit, didn't we, about this idea that taking this strong customer first position and actually delivering on it is something we're seeing more and more of. I'd love to hear what you think about that and how you're viewing it at Ageas, and sort of where you think it might go next.
Yeah, I think it's been fantastic to see across financial services the way in which companies have responded to help customers, particularly vulnerable customers, which is something that at Ageas we're very keen on champion, and particularly given the target market that we're dealing with, and that, you know, in this crisis, many financial service companies have off their own back launched campaigns to help certain sectors and certain target markets. So, for example, within our own industry and insurance, we've seen refunds back to customers who've not been using their products, and all sorts of things like that, which has been great. And nobody's told them to do that. That's something that they have recognised is a good way of maintaining their customer relationships and retaining those customers. So I think it's great, and it seems that the way in which companies have done that is to really unlock the customer insights from how those customers are feeling and the way that they're behaving. And I think, you know, I also talked with you about the sort of secret knowledge of the CMO, and the fact that we hold a huge amount of information and we can see customer behaviour probably more clearly than any other part of the organisation, and we can identify where those needs are and where those needs have changed, and then suggest and put forward ideas of how we can improve and change our services, and particularly where CMOs have influence or control over the customer experience. And I think increasingly, as customers are using the digital channel more, that often tends to sit and fall within the CMO's remit, which is great.
John, we've talked as colleagues about this idea that, you know, fundamentally what we've got is a situation where there's sort of a hangover from the 2008 crisis, but actually this is an enormous opportunity. I mean, you've worked with all sorts of different financial services brands. What are the things that you would suggest are sort of the right steps to be taking? You know, building on what Ellie's just said, what are the right steps for some of these brands to be taking over the coming weeks and months as they enter 2021 to make sure that they are effectively rehabilitating their position in the minds of consumers and starting to really embed themselves as a trusted advisor, to use the language from earlier, for consumers as they manage this horrendous challenge?
No, it's a really important question, and I'm really passionate about this kind of aspect of the role that financial services can play. And it's very interesting. Right before this webinar, it was on a call with the potential client around, and the point that came up around the fact that doing some research around it, coming up with propositions 4 or 5 years ago, there was this big trust factor that was weighing on the sector, which made it difficult to pursue certain opportunities. I mean, I think now a lot of that has moved on quite a bit, and you're absolutely right that financial services isn't the cause of the pandemic. I think there's a potential trap, which is that we feel good about not being the bad guys this time, and so we make big promises that we don't necessarily back up through the actual core of our business. I think it was about a year ago when Jamie Dimon and the Business Roundtable came out with big fanfare this idea of, we're moving to stakeholder capitalism. And really all that means is sort of making sure that we're taking a balanced scorecard approach to our business and our business operations. that's not enough, right? If we're really going to be purpose-driven, if we're really going to be good actors in society, what are the opportunities that some of these new unmet needs that are emerging represent for us as a business, right? So there are going to be loads of unemployed people who will probably become self-employed in the next few months to years. Are there new financial products? Are there new business banking services that can be developed to help meet those needs? I think it's not good enough, and Raj is absolutely right to say to be customer centric, but I think it's about being stakeholder centric and really being cognizant, taking all that data and information that we have about the outside world as marketers to present those opportunities to say, hey, I know you love this ad campaign, which makes us feel good about ourselves, and we make these big promises. Here are some things that we can really put some money behind to actually deliver on those promises, and also deliver ultimately commercial benefit to the firm.
I mean, I can see Neil smiling and nodding, and I can see Leigh doing the same. I'm going to come to you first, Neil, and then I'll come to you, Leigh. But it feels like that was a tailor-made answer to set up what you're doing at Lowell.
Yeah, and I guess just given the audience that we've got here, so it's remembering that we're all people and we're all dealing with people at the end of the day, and never ever lose sight of that. And whatever part of the sector that you're in financial services, the kind of hierarchy of needs, if you want to go down that route, is that we're all here in some guise to help somebody get a better future. You know, I've happened to have done it in pensions and investments. Then when we went to set up the bank, Leigh and myself and a good few others, and it was all about trust and how do you give off the experience that customers are having in the right way, and so we put a huge amount of effort into Trustpilot and connecting that to all the right on and offline experiences. Lo and behold, it's one of the best banks in the UK, and we've adopted that model for our customers in Lowell as well. So dare I say, we are in a position where rebuilding financial health is there because the ills that have gone on in other areas of financial services, where customers have been encouraged to take credit more than they should have done, for example, and were there to mop some of that up, but to help people get out of it sustainably. And again, going back to John's point on purpose, there's, from a personal perspective, I'm on the hook for commercials, absolutely, but going back to the people bit, you know, why I joined the company was all about, well, if I can get 500,000 people sustainably out of debt over the next 2 or 3 years as we hit this horrible economic downturn that's coming, then I'll have done my job, I guess. And the byproduct is the commercials that surround that. And again, it's just keeping it as simple as you possibly can. I think it's, you know, whilst
I think we might have just heard Neil's stream just drop whilst he was answering that question. So I'm going to come to you, Leigh, if that's all right, just to pick up from what he was saying. You know, Atom Bank is an interesting proposition in and of itself, but one of the things that I love about it is that it's focused absolutely on the customer and focused on creating a broader experience than simply just sort of what's available in the marketplace. I mean, to John's point about, you know, thinking bigger, that's sort of at the core of what you're all about, right?
Yeah, and I think to answer your observation earlier as to while I was smiling, I think it's from the question in terms of, is this an opportunity for banks to re-establish their reputation, rebuild their reputation? The fact that the crisis happened 12 years ago, you would hope that things have already been put in place to start to rebuild that reputation, and you would want brands in general to see this as an opportunity to demonstrate what has been done, rather than opportunism to go, look, you know, there's this small event, we have done this now, and then forget about it elsewhere. You see that quite often with a lot of, obviously this year's been very important social movements. You've seen it years past where brands will jump on them, and then you see nothing in terms of implementation into that brand, into that business. So, you know, even before going into this crisis, there's a huge issue with financial literacy. So the fact that, and there's a piece of research which we just commissioned, which will be out in the market relatively soon. But one of the stats from there is that people know more about their blood type, more about the offside rule in football than they do about how a financial product works. Now, I don't mean the mechanisms that the product guys here know. It's the simple facts of interest rates, it's a simple fact of money in and out, bonus rates, limits on withdrawals, all these kind of things. So there were some fundamentals going into this crisis that were the opportunity for redemption, if that's the right word, or at least demonstration of a more empathetic and a more considered financial services brand. But kind of talking about Atom specifically, to Neil's point that you mentioned earlier, we have been built from the customer outwards, and the way that we look at that is not just the information that we get in, but the behaviors of being empathetic. Being customer centric is just being empathetic and being able to put yourself in the shoes of customers in certain situations. Mm-hmm. Now, if you consider that with the context of financial services, where, to be pretty frank, most people think it's boring and most people don't take that much interest in it. You're more likely to get divorced and switch your current account, apparently. So it's about considering all those things and thinking, right, if I am truly in the shoes of my customer and I am building this product, or I'm thinking about this need, then how does that manifest across what it is that we do? How's that, again, to talk about notifications again, it goes all the way from the notifications that are triggered off the back of an action to the way you get people into the business, the way that you talk to them when they are a customer, when they're not a customer. It filters through everything that you do, and we're fortunate that we came along at a point and were founded by people that had that mentality and that perspective. So it comes quite naturally to us.
I think what's really interesting about all of this is that we're sort of dancing around this linkage between what traditionally was sort of the promotion of the brand that sat within the marketing kind of sphere of influence, and that linkage between that and the customer experience, which has become so crucial through the crisis, if it wasn't already. And I'm just reminded of a comment that Pete Markey made to me, Pete Markey, the CMO of a TSB bank here in the UK, about his fear. We were talking about something called the experience gap, which is one of our pieces of IP here at Clare, which sort of tries to size the gap between what brands are saying and what they're actually physically doing in the experience. And it won't surprise anyone here, I don't think, that brands have a significant gap between what they're saying and what they're doing. Some do it far better than others, but everybody has a gap. And the experience gap sort of got us into a conversation with Pete, which was around this idea that actually, and this was pre-crisis, before the sort of rapid additional digitization that happened as a result of COVID, he was talking to me about this sort of concern that as particularly financial services brands rapidly digitize their services and strip away some of the sort of in-person part of their experience, that actually they become more and more and more utilitarian and less and less and less human. Now, that's a worst case scenario, I think, in his head. But I'd be really interested in your perspective, Ellie. We talked about this a bit yesterday, about how you make sure that the distinctiveness of an Ageas kind of proposition, the people, the culture, everything that makes up that sort of ineffable quality of what the brand really stands for actually comes through and shines when you're engaging with customers.
Yeah, so I think, as marketing people, we all want to create that customer value proposition, and we will develop and evolve and improve that as we go along. I think it's and fundamentally that's driven by customer need. Sometimes the customer doesn't necessarily know what they need, so we have to go and kind of go out and try and find it and try and remind them. So that's where the whole thing sort of starts. And then I think it's, as Neil talked about, the development of that purpose, and purpose within marketing is a buzzword that's been around for a while now. But I think we're still learning how to crack that. And I think, it has become so much more important as people are becoming more discerning with who they're spending their money with throughout this pandemic. And people are watching their pennies, and therefore they're considering who they want to spend their money with even more than they have ever before. And they're looking for companies that have that purpose. And we're all looking to see how we can develop purpose further, even in the purposeful organisations. I think we're trying to understand the customers who we can really tap into and work with.
And I guess how you deliver it. I mean, Raj, at Aviva, there's a question for me about how you then make sure that the big ideals that sit at the top of your strategy then kind of percolate down through every touch point that you have with a customer. I mean, how are you making sure that that's the case, and has that changed? Has that improved? Have you had more pressure to do that as a result of the crisis?
I think, no, it definitely has. To your point, I don't think, well, roll back. I do feel that the narrative is a bit lazy when it comes to digital. The fact that you can sell something online or you can buy something online is hardly a barometer of digital transformation, which everybody seems to take these days. I mean, they should be doing that since 2002, really. But when we look at digitization, and something which was said is, we look at the empathy part of it. You make that human-centered design. We are people dealing with people. And digitization really helps. So for example, when any FTSE company with a bit of a legacy would have all these legacy systems. Now, do you think that when I call into you, that I don't have to switch screens, that I don't have to switch systems, that I don't have to hand you over to my neighbor to finish your call, et cetera, does that make it better? Absolutely, it does make it better. Does the fact that I recognize what you're trying to search for once you're on my website, or what you come in for even before you really know it, so we give you the right path? Absolutely, that is something there. So I think the humanity doesn't go away because you develop a digital pathway or you digitize parts of your organization, because the end result in mind is your need as a human. And what we say is, which is part of our thinking, is that we live in the same streets as you, we sort of work in the same towns as you. We are part, we're about 30,000 people or whatever. We live, breathe the same air. We have the same needs as you guys. So we should be able to design. We're not a entity just as a business, a monolith over there. So we do look at that in our design, definitely. And one of the things I feel is that empathy is always taken the wrong way, which is meant to be you're being generous, you're being really nice, you're being really good. Empathy is about stepping into the shoes, feeling those pebbles as you walk and knowing what those are, designing for that. Empathy is not just nice words. So I think that is also something that we look into. The delivery mechanism is definitely, I think, changing. So we have to look at new ways in which we communicate this humanity. You had the luxury of 30 seconds on TV. Now, when you're looking at ad rolls, etc., it's 5 seconds, 4 seconds. Attention spans are very limited. And within those 5 seconds, 90% of the marketers go, I want the logo, I want the brand, I want the call to action. There's very little left to build any emotion and bond, to be really honest. So I think what you're looking at is the design, the proposition itself, and whatever else that you're talking about, the stakeholders. We haven't even touched on things like ESG. We haven't even talked about inclusivity, diversity. The demand on the management and companies is much more than just profit. It is all about, well, you're there. Are you doing any good for society as well? And that gives you a massive opportunity to showcase your humanity. With any of the companies.
I think it's a lovely way to sort of step into another comment we had from a previous panelist, actually, a lady called Abigail Posner, who heads up Google's brand unit. Abigail, as I'm sure you'd be unsurprised to hear, was unbelievably passionate about the fact that she believes that actually digital channels done well in the modern era increase the levels of humanity that brands can bring to the table in their experience, rather than decrease it and make it less human and more automated. And actually, she said a big part of that is actually using the data properly to actually engage with behavior as it appears and solve for those challenges in those behaviors. And I think that's what I found really interesting about talking to you, Neil, about the sort of the work you're doing at Lowell, which is understanding, kind of getting right into the back end of your website, sitting next to your product development team and your production team and going, actually, I want to get into the nuts and bolts of this and make the experience the very best it can be. And particularly with a vulnerable audience, I think it's crucial, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a massive advocate of proposition development and defining the customer experience sitting under the CMO role. I think that's the only way you can possibly have a chance at getting a consistent brand experience, whatever touch point a customer goes into. But a little sneak preview and things that we're looking at. So when a customer comes online and fills out their income and expenditure to understand how much spare income that they've got to be able to help pay their debts, if we're going to start seeing customers going round that loop over and over again, putting in different incomes and expenditures to try and manipulate an outcome at the end, that red light will start to flash to say we've got a vulnerable customer here who is either trying to overstretch themselves, or we need to have that physical conversation with them, and which goes back to How do you engage them, get them into our customer care centre to have that human interaction and human conversation when it comes to the stress and emotion that's around financial vulnerability. And I appreciate and understand Pete Markey's comments, and I love him to bits, and I understand exactly where it's come from. But if I look at some of I'll go back to the fintechs again. Starling Bank here in the UK, fantastic bank. I moved everything across to them a few years ago, and any need that I get to speak to them is all done by chatbot. And because we work in the industry, you can kind of see where the virtual assistant kicks into the chatbot, but it's seamless, and and the language and tone is all about expressing humanity and empathy. So I don't think you need to necessarily have that face-to-face contact, which is the challenges that certainly here in the UK that the big retail banks are facing into, as going back to, be useful and specific about your use to customers. The fintechs are picking off, bits of propositions left, right, and centre.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in your perspective on this, Leigh, coming from in effect, a fintech in Atom. I mean, the focus that I guess you must have being an entirely digital business, and sort of the lessons that you've learned on the journey as to how to inject that humanity, that sense of what the brand stands for, what the people behind the brand bring to the table through an entirely digital experience must be fascinating. I'm really interested to hear your perspective on, how you make sure that a purely digital proposition is also really human and empathetic.
A dictatorial kind of control, basically. No, so to a point which I think everyone's made is the fact that just you have the removal of humans doesn't mean it becomes less human. Is the fact that it's all about the set of values and principles that define us as humans. I know that's a big existential debate, of course, but those key things of true empathy, of the way that you are designing every single part that you do, and the bit that I referenced about being dictatorial, is that we were lucky that, again, to have marketing at the beginning of the building of the bank meant that we were able to be involved in all aspects and all customer touch points. So that means that, again, not to reference again, but any notification, any app screen that's created, the scripts that are, or the training that we put our CSAs through. So we don't have automated kind of chatbots at the moment. It's all people who actually aren't in this building currently or working from home, but it's a relatively small team. But that team goes through a kind of extensive training with marketing representation to talk through the tone of voice. And I don't mean tone of voice in a really arbitrary kind of, here's a 50-page document for you to read, have a little read through that. These are the words we use, these are the words we don't use. It's more of a guide as to this is the brand, this is what it stands for. This is how we're communicating in other channels. Therefore, read this, take it in and express, and we give them that freedom to be able to express their view of who and what Atom stand for in the way they communicate with customers. Otherwise, you get to a rather inauthentic and robotic way of communicating. So, it's a tricky thing to start off as a quite small business and with relatively few channels, and then get to the size that we are now with increasing amount of channels and increasing amount of products to be able to have that control. But if all of those people who are in charge of every customer touch point have the understanding of what the brand stands for, then you're going to kind of get that consistency, and you're going to be able to deliver that same kind of human touch across all those touch points.
Thank you. I think I'm going to come back to you, John, just to get your thoughts on this, and then we'll just wrap up. But John, we've heard some really interesting points about humanity, about empathy, about the responsibility of senior marketers to provide the excos that they work with the information, the insight, but also the guidance as to how to shape a response to not only what's happened just now, but how to do it properly as we go into next year and beyond. And we've also thought quite extensively about this idea of moving beyond. I loved Raj's comment just earlier about this sort of the sort of 5-second pre-roll being the kind of the key way that messages come across right now. And actually you've got to think differently about where you might want to invest if you're going to build a depth of relationship. What's your perspective? I mean, is 2021 the year when finally we see a rebalancing of budgets to see more investment and more responsibility placed on the CMO to invest wisely across the experience rather than just in communications?
So I'm not in the business of predictions, but I think what you will see is that there's probably going to be a bifurcation, right? So some will and some won't. I think what's really important, I completely agree with all the comments about empathy in product design, right? How do we make propositions that actually connect with people? One point that I just wanted to bring up around that is that it's so important that the people who know the customer insight, who really understand the customers that you're trying to reach, are working hand in glove with those product teams. And I haven't worked with a ton of organizations that are great at doing that. But if you don't have that linkage at the beginning, it's going to be much harder to kind of retrofit something that hasn't been designed really with a human being in mind. And I think the other point to make, linking to Raja's point around sort of diversity and inclusion, making sure that people are designing, people who look like the people whose products are designed for are actually involved in that process, which we all know is another issue as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think sort of reframing the CMO, but beyond kind of that commercialization role, but as really a fountain of knowledge, both practical information that you can use to meet sort of shorter term objectives, but also the one who is trying to make sense of this landscape, bring all these different bits and pieces of data together and have a point of view in those leadership discussions is really a massive opportunity. And I think we've touched on probably just 10% of the different facets of that opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's at this point that I reveal to the audience that actually we're going to be looking at that in a lot more detail as Clare over the coming months in our new piece of IP that we're intending to launch throughout October, November, December with a white paper in January. We're going to be looking at sort of the chaos of the marketing ecosystem and why we feel like CMOs are best placed to really step forward and support their businesses as they look to grow in 21 and beyond. Thank you so much to this wonderful panel. I'm just going to summarize some of the thoughts and then wrap this up. But I think what I've really loved about this debate is that it's stayed in a place which has been around the responsibility of marketers in this industry to do a job to support their colleagues, their stakeholders, and their customers better as they manage this crisis. You know, that support with insights, support with better experiences, support with better products and services, and support with the communications that's needed at the time to help people to navigate these challenges. I think that's a hugely important point to take away from this. I think the other thing I've loved is this sort of thread of empathy and humanity that's kind of gone through the whole discussion. This idea that actually this seamless humanity, I think for a long time, all I've heard from all of the big voices is the more you digitize, and this is because of the press in all the markets, you know, the more you digitize, the more you strip away bank branches, the more you strip away customer service centers and go to a more automated and artificial intelligence driven or chatbot driven future, that actually that strips away the humanity. But I think I'm increasingly of the mind, and I think more and more people are increasingly of the mind that done well, and this panel has just walked us through this, you know, done well, these digital channels actually enhance the empathy and humanity of the experience, and also can be an enhancer of the differentiation and distinctiveness of the brand in question if it's done really, really well. And then finally, I think it's this this question of purpose, which keeps coming back in this series of Clear conversations. You know, it's an opportunity, particularly for this sector, with its track record of 2008 that it's trying to work through, to actually finally put its money where its mouth is. And what's been lovely to see is that a lot of brands have little things here and there, rebates here and there, you know, pausing of payment holidays for all sorts of different things, from mortgages to credit cards. And what I've loved is that hasn't always been forced upon you by the regulator. For I think the first time in my history in the financial services industry, there's been a proactivity amongst executive committees and marketers in the space to say, look, we think we could do something nice for our customers that we think is within the regulator requirements. So let's just go and do it, get it done, and help these people out in their hour of need. And that can only be a positive thing for this sector. Because then in that way, actually all this investment that you've all made in purpose statements that to say wonderful things about how you'll bring more than just profit to your stakeholders and shareholders actually becomes true. And I'm really hopeful that as we enter 2021 and move beyond that, we can see more of this investment in sort of rubber hit the road combination marketing between the communications that sets the story up and demonstrates what we're all trying to achieve, and then the actual impact of that in the experience on the day-to-day. So thank you so much to our fabulous panel, Raj Kumar, Ellie Mickleburgh, Leigh Peacock-Goodwin, Neil Costello, and of course John Riley. That is the end of the first season of Clear Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you hopefully in the second season kicking off on October 7th. Thank you again.